Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, how this business arrangement turns into something neither of them expected. The next day, Mark stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie for what felt like the 100th time. His reflection showed a man dressed in a crisp suit, but the nerves in his chest betrayed his appearance. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing. Marrying a stranger for money felt absurd, yet the weight of his debts and the looming threat of losing everything made it feel like his only option. The business deal, the signing of the contract, it all felt like a bad dream he was trapped in. But Eleanor Brooks had made it clear this was no time for second guessing. It was all or nothing. At precisely 1 p.m., Mark arrived at Brooks Enterprises, a towering glass building that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. His heart pounded as he entered the lobby, the cold, sterile atmosphere making him feel even more out of place. A sleek receptionist led him to the elevator, and with each floor they ascended, Mark could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him harder. The doors opened to a lavish office on the top floor, the kind of place where deals were made and fates were sealed. Eleanor was already there, standing by the window, her back turned as she gazed out over the city. "You're here," Eleanor said without turning, her voice calm as ever. Mark nodded, unsure of what to say. She finally turned to face him, her eyes sharp as ever. "We'll sign the agreement now, and you'll begin your role as my husband as soon as the papers are filed. Remember, this is strictly professional. There's no room for emotions in this arrangement." Mark swallowed hard. The word stung, but he knew it was what he had to do. He had no choice. The lawyer entered the room with a thick folder in his hands, and as he laid out the contract in front of Mark, the reality of the situation hit him. He had agreed to something he couldn't take back. But as Eleanor explained the terms once again, Mark tried to push aside the nagging voice in his head. This wasn't about love, it was about survival. His survival. After the agreement was signed, Eleanor handed Mark a key to her penthouse, a place he would now call home. "You'll need to attend a few events with me, starting tomorrow. I'll handle the media. You just have to show up and act the part," she instructed coolly. Mark nodded, feeling like a puppet on strings, his every move already decided for him. As he left her office, his hands shook slightly, the weight of the key in his palm reminding him that this was no longer just a business arrangement, it was a life-altering decision. Eleanor Brooks was a woman of few words, but her power, her cold, calculated control over everything around her, was unmistakable. Mark had no idea what he was getting into, but he knew one thing for certain: his life would never be the same. The next evening, Mark arrived at the penthouse, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The apartment was everything he had expected: sleek, modern, and filled with art and luxury. As he walked through the space, he felt the weight of his new life settling over him. This wasn't his world. He was just a visitor in a place where everything was about appearance and control. Eleanor was already there, sitting on the couch, flipping through papers. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "I know this is a lot to take in," she said, her voice softer than usual. "But this is the deal. You play your part, and we both get what we need." Mark nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He wasn't sure if he was playing a part anymore. This was starting to feel like something else, something real. Over the next few weeks, Mark attended galas, business meetings, and social events with Eleanor. He kept his distance, following the rules of their arrangement: no emotions, no intimacy. But with each passing day, he started to notice the cracks in the icy facade she had built around herself. She was always so composed, so in control. But there were moments, brief and fleeting, when her walls came down. Mark could see the loneliness in her eyes, the vulnerability she hid so carefully. She was hiding something, and though he knew he shouldn't care, he found himself wanting to know what. One evening, after a particularly exhausting gala, Mark found himself walking down the hallway of the penthouse. Eleanor was standing by the window, staring out at the city. She didn't turn when he approached, but he could hear the quiet sadness in her voice when she spoke. "I didn't expect it to be like this," she said softly. "I didn't expect anyone to notice." Mark stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. Eleanor Brooke, so powerful, so commanding, was admitting to something he never thought he'd hear. She wasn't as untouchable as she wanted everyone to believe. Mark stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do or say. But before he could speak, she turned to face him, her expression hardening again. "Remember," she said, her voice back to its usual coldness, "this is just business. No feelings. Just the deal." But something in her eyes told him otherwise. Mark wasn't sure what was happening between them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this arrangement was becoming something much more complicated than either of them had intended. As Mark lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he wondered what would happen if he let his guard down. What if he started to care about Eleanor? What if she started to care about him? Could they ever make this work, or was it just another contract, another deal that would end the same way it had begun, cold and detached? Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where everything changes with a single revelation. Days passed in a blur of gala events, business meetings, and endless social appearances. Mark was becoming increasingly familiar with the charade he had to play. By day, he was the well-dressed husband of Eleanor Brooks, the mysterious and powerful businesswoman who seemed so untouchable, yet had somehow drawn him into her world. By night, he struggled with the growing feelings he was starting to develop for her, feelings he knew he couldn't afford to have. But despite his best efforts to keep things strictly professional, he couldn't ignore the quiet moments they shared. Eleanor, the woman who seemed to have everything under control, was beginning to show cracks in her perfect armor. One evening, after a particularly lavish charity event, Mark found himself alone in the penthouse. Eleanor was still at the event, speaking with potential investors. He was supposed to wait for her to return, but something compelled him to look out the window at the city below. The skyline glittered with lights, a stark contrast to the emptiness he felt inside. He hadn't expected this arrangement to affect him the way it had. Eleanor had asked for no emotions, and at first, that had seemed like a perfectly reasonable request. But now, the lines between business and something more were beginning to blur. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. Eleanor stepped inside, her face tired but composed. "I didn't expect you to be waiting up for me," she said, her voice almost soft. Mark stood up from the couch, trying to push his emotions aside. "I couldn't sleep," he said simply. She gave him a small nod, as if understanding, though her expression remained guarded. She had always been so distant, so in control, but Mark could see the faint signs of weariness beneath her composed exterior. "Long night?" Mark asked, hoping to keep the conversation light. Eleanor sighed and dropped her purse on the coffee table. "Always is. The business never stops." She glanced at him, then looked away, her eyes betraying a hint of vulnerability. "It's exhausting, pretending all the time. Pretending everything is fine, when it's not. But I have no choice." Mark could feel the weight of her words, though he knew better than to push too hard. "You don't have to pretend with me," he said quietly, almost instinctively. At his words, Eleanor froze. Her gaze snapped to him, a mixture of surprise and something else flickering in her eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, and Mark felt the weight of the unspoken words between them. He had no right to say that. They were in this arrangement for one reason: to maintain appearances. But something inside him wanted to break through that wall, wanted to reach her and understand what was really going on beneath her icy exterior. "You don't know anything about me," Eleanor said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "No one does." "Not really." Mark could see the pain in her eyes now, something raw and unguarded that she had never shown him before. It was as if she was finally letting herself be seen. The moment was brief, but it felt significant, like a shift in the dynamic between them. Mark stepped closer, unsure of what to do, but driven by something inside him. I'm not asking to know everything. But you don't have to do this alone, Eleanor. I know I'm just a contract to you, but he paused, the words coming out before he could stop them. But I want to help. I want to be there for you. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he instantly regretted saying anything. This wasn't supposed to be about feelings. But the truth was, he was tired of pretending, too. Eleanor took a step back, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were weighing his words. Then, she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. You don't understand, she said, her voice once again hardening. This was never supposed to be about me. It's about what I need. What I've always needed. She moved toward the bar and poured herself a glass of wine, avoiding his gaze. Mark watched her for a moment, feeling the gap between them widen again. Then why did you ask me to do this? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. Eleanor's back was to him, and for a long moment, there was silence in the room. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I had no choice, she said. Because sometimes, when you have everything, you end up feeling like you have nothing. The words hit Mark harder than he expected. He was starting to understand. Eleanor wasn't as invincible as she appeared. She was just as broken as anyone else, carrying a weight that no amount of money or power could fix. Mark walked over to her, standing beside her as she stared into her glass of wine. You don't have to be alone, Eleanor. We can make this work. We can do more than just pretend. The words felt like a leap of faith, but in that moment, Mark knew he couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not after everything that had happened between them. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She said nothing for a long time, but her eyes softened. For the first time, she wasn't the untouchable woman he had met at the beginning of this arrangement. She was someone vulnerable, someone in need of connection. And Mark realized, in that moment, that maybe this arrangement wasn't just about money or survival. Maybe it was about something much deeper, something that neither of them could have predicted. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Mark and Eleanor's bond deepens, and they are faced with choices that will change everything. The days following their conversation felt different. Eleanor had pulled back into her usual cold, calculated self, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. They were no longer just two people playing a part, they were beginning to blur the lines of their arrangement. Every time Mark looked at Eleanor, he saw something more than the businesswoman he had signed up to work for. He saw the woman who, despite her wealth and power, carried a heavy burden that no one knew about. But he didn't know how to get through to her. How to help her with the walls she had built around herself. It was late one evening when Mark found himself standing by the window of their penthouse, staring out at the city below. It had been a week since their last conversation, and Eleanor had been distant, as if nothing had changed. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the unspoken tension between them was growing. He wanted to help her. He wanted to be more than just the man in this contract. But every time he tried to bridge the gap, she pulled away. He couldn't understand why she wouldn't let him in. The sound of the door opening behind him broke his thoughts. He turned to find Eleanor standing there, her expression unreadable as always, but tonight there was something different in her eyes. She had been at a meeting all day, handling the details of an important deal. Mark knew she was exhausted, but as usual, she didn't let it show. You're up late, Eleanor said, her voice soft, but with an edge of concern. Couldn't sleep, Mark replied, his voice low. He couldn't explain it, but he had the strangest feeling that something was about to change. Maybe we should talk, he added, his heart pounding in his chest. Eleanor hesitated, then closed the door behind her and walked toward him. Talk about what? She asked, her voice guarded. She had always been so careful with her words, so precise, and Mark couldn't help but feel the distance between them growing. It was like no matter how close they got, she always found a way to push him back. Talk about us, Mark said, his voice uncertain. I don't want this to just be a contract anymore, Eleanor. I'm starting to feel something for you. And I don't want to keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not. He took a deep breath, waiting for her response. He had no idea if she would accept what he was saying or shut him down completely. Eleanor's eyes softened for a moment, and Mark saw a flicker of something he had never seen before: vulnerability. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the same cold expression she always wore. You don't understand, Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. This was never supposed to be about feelings. It was never supposed to be about love. It was supposed to be a way out of something I couldn't handle alone. She turned away from him, walking toward the bar and pouring herself a drink. But now you're talking about things that I can't give you. Things I don't have to offer. Mark stood there, his heart racing. He had known this was coming. He had known it was too good to be true. But hearing the words spoken aloud hit him harder than he expected. He had hoped, somewhere deep down, that Eleanor would open up to him. That she would see that he wasn't just in this for the money. That he wanted something real. But as he watched Eleanor, standing there, so distant and closed off, he realized that maybe he had been fooling himself all along. Maybe this was never going to be more than a business deal to her. Maybe he was just another pawn in her carefully controlled life. He walked toward her slowly, his footsteps heavy in the silence. I didn't come here for the money, Eleanor, he said quietly. I came here because I thought we could help each other. But I can't keep pretending that this is nothing to me. I can't keep pretending that I don't care about you. For a moment, Eleanor didn't speak. She just stood there, holding her glass, staring down at it as if it held all the answers she didn't have. Mark felt a wave of frustration wash over him, but he didn't give up. He stepped closer, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I don't know what's holding you back, but I'm not going anywhere. I care about you, and I'm not going to walk away just because you push me away. We can figure this out together. Eleanor's grip on her glass tightened, and for a split second, Mark thought she might break it. Then, without warning, she set the glass down on the counter and turned to face him. You don't understand, she repeated, but her voice was different this time, softer, almost pleading. I can't let anyone in. I've built this life around being in control. And if I let you in, I lose that control. I lose everything. Mark reached out slowly, placing his hand on hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension between them was thick, but in that moment, it didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a chance. A chance to truly connect. You don't have to lose everything, Mark said gently. You don't have to do this alone. The silence that followed felt like an eternity, but Eleanor didn't pull away. Instead, she finally met his gaze, her eyes searching his as if looking for something she had lost long ago. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Eleanor faces her fears and opens up to Mark, but the path ahead is full of unexpected twists. The next morning, Mark woke up early, the soft light of dawn filtering through the curtains. He hadn't slept much, his mind still racing from the conversation with Eleanor the night before. He could still feel the warmth of her hand in his, the way she had looked at him, as if for the first time, she was allowing herself to be vulnerable. But even then, the walls she had built around herself were still strong, and he wasn't sure if she was truly ready to let them down. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was starting to understand something important. Eleanor wasn't just a businesswoman trying to protect her legacy, she was a woman who had spent her entire life pushing people away, afraid of getting hurt, afraid of losing control. As he got dressed and prepared for another day, Mark's thoughts kept returning to Eleanor. She was so different from the woman he had first met, so much more than the cold, calculating business mogul he had assumed her to be. He knew she had a past, a story that she had never shared with him, and part of him wanted to know it all. But he understood that now wasn't the time. She had to be ready to share, and he couldn't force her. But he could be patient, something he had never been good at, especially when it came to matters of the heart. Yet something inside him told him that Eleanor was worth the wait. When Mark arrived at the office later that day, he found Eleanor already in her usual spot behind her desk, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her. She looked up when she heard him enter, and for the first time in days, there was a hint of something different in her eyes, something softer, more open. "You're early," Eleanor said, her voice still professional, but with a warmth Mark had never heard before. He smiled as he took a seat across from her, feeling the tension between them slowly ease. It wasn't gone, but it was a start. "I had some things on my mind," he replied, watching as she pushed a pile of paperwork aside and gave him her full attention. She looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing something in her mind. "I know I've been distant," Eleanor said quietly. It's hard for me to trust people. After everything I've been through, I don't let anyone in. And I certainly don't let anyone get close enough to see the real me." She hesitated, and Mark could tell that she was choosing her words carefully, but the openness in her voice was something he hadn't expected. It was a glimpse into the person she had kept hidden for so long. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he leaned forward, wanting to make sure she knew that he was listening, that he wasn't going anywhere. "Eleanor, you don't have to explain yourself." "I get it," he said softly. "But I'm not here because of the contract. I'm here because I care about you. I want to understand what you're going through, and I want to be here for you. If you'll let me." There was a long pause as Eleanor looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together nervously. Mark could see the internal struggle in her eyes. She wanted to let him in, he could feel it. But something was holding her back, something deeper than just their arrangement. Finally, Eleanor looked up, her gaze meeting his. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can let someone get close enough to see the parts of me that I've kept hidden. I've spent so long building this life, this empire. I've built it all on my own, and I don't know how to let anyone in." Mark's heart ached for her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of losing control, of losing everything she had worked so hard to build, but he also saw something else, a flicker of hope, a willingness to trust him just a little. It was small, but it was there. "You don't have to let me in all at once," Mark said gently. "I'm not asking you to change everything right now. Just take it one step at a time. If you need space, I'll give you space. But I'm not going anywhere." He reached out and placed his hand on top of hers, offering her the comfort she so desperately needed. For a moment, Eleanor didn't move. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe I've been too focused on controlling everything, on making sure nothing slips through my fingers. But maybe, just maybe, it's time to let someone in." Mark smiled, relieved. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And that was enough for now. As they continued to talk, Mark could feel the distance between them slowly shrinking. Eleanor was still guarded, still hesitant, but for the first time, she seemed willing to take that first step toward letting him in. And as they finished their conversation and prepared to go to the next meeting, Mark felt a glimmer of hope. This wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. It was something real. And for the first time, it felt like it had a chance of working. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Mark and Eleanor's relationship is put to the test, and they face challenges that could either bring them closer or tear them apart. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, the space between Mark and Eleanor began to shrink. It was a slow process, one that neither of them had expected. Eleanor, once so cold and guarded, was starting to let Mark in, bit by bit. There were still walls around her, walls that had been built over years of pain and disappointment. But she was beginning to trust him, at least enough to share fragments of her past. And Mark, despite his initial reservations, was beginning to see that this wasn't just about business. It was about two people finding something real in the middle of all the chaos. It was one late afternoon when the next turning point came. Mark had been working in his office when he received a message from Eleanor. She asked him to meet her at the company's conference room for an important meeting. He had no idea what to expect, but the tone of her message had been different, urgent, but not in the way she usually was. It felt personal. When Mark arrived, the door to the conference room was slightly ajar. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, and there she was. Eleanor was standing by the large window, looking out at the skyline, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. She didn't turn when he entered, but Mark could feel the tension in the room. "Eleanor," he called softly. She turned, her face pale, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. It was the first time he had seen her like this, vulnerable in a way that made his heart ache. "I need your help," she said, her voice low. "There's something I have to do. Something I should have done a long time ago." Mark stepped forward, concern flooding through him. "What's going on? You're scaring me." Eleanor shook her head, trying to hold back the emotion threatening to break free. "I've spent my entire life building this empire, Mark. But it wasn't just about the business. It was about control. I've always been afraid to lose it. To let anyone see the real me. But now I realize that it's not just about control. It's about protecting everything I've built. And that means making some difficult decisions." Her voice trembled as she spoke, and Mark could see the weight of the decisions she was facing in her eyes. Mark took a step closer, his heart pounding. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice steady. "What decisions?" Eleanor let out a breath, her shoulders sagging. "There are people in my life who've been taking advantage of me, Mark. People who want to destroy everything I've worked for. And I've been blind to it." Mark's mind raced as he tried to piece together what she was saying. "Who?" he asked, his voice tense. "Who's been trying to hurt you?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment before finally speaking. "It's my brother. Nathan." Her voice was thick with anger and regret. "I've always kept him at arm's length, but he's been slowly manipulating things behind the scenes. I didn't realize until it was almost too late. He's been siphoning money from the company, forging documents, trying to take control of everything. And now I have to stop him." Mark stood there, stunned. He had no idea Eleanor had been dealing with something so serious. "How can I help?" he asked immediately. "Whatever it is, we can fix it together." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I don't want to do this alone, Mark. I'm afraid of what might happen if I do. I've been carrying this burden for so long, and I've kept everyone at a distance. But you've shown me that there's more to life than just control. You've made me see that I don't have to do this on my own." Mark's heart swelled as he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to gently touch hers. "You're not alone, Eleanor. I've got your back. We'll handle this together." For the first time in a long while, Eleanor let out a soft breath, a weight lifting off her shoulders. She looked at him with a new sense of trust in her eyes, and for the first time, Mark felt like they were truly in this together. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and planning as they worked together to expose Nathan's deception. Eleanor's fear of losing control was still there, but with Mark by her side, she began to face her demons head-on. She was starting to let go of the need to control everything, and in doing so, she was learning to trust Mark not just as her business partner, but as someone she could rely on emotionally. As they worked together, Mark couldn't help but notice the change in her. The more she allowed herself to be vulnerable, the stronger she seemed. It was as though the walls she had built for so long were crumbling, and the person he was beginning to see, this woman who was strong, yet deeply human, was someone he had grown to care for deeply. And as for Eleanor, she realized that in letting go of control, she was gaining something far more valuable: the ability to love and trust again. Something she had almost forgotten how to do. She wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to find out. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Mark and Eleanor face their greatest challenge yet and discover just how deep their feelings for each other truly run. The days following their decision to confront Nathan felt like a blur. Eleanor and Mark worked tirelessly together, gathering evidence, consulting lawyers, and putting together a plan to expose the truth. The tension between them had shifted from uncertainty to something deeper. It was no longer just about the contract or the business arrangement, it was about trust. Mark had stood by her side through it all, and Eleanor began to realize that maybe, just maybe, she had underestimated the power of having someone in her life she could truly rely on. But even as the plan to take down Nathan started to take shape, Eleanor knew the hardest part was still ahead. Nathan was not someone to go down easily. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fear of losing everything she had worked for still loomed large. One evening, after a long day of strategizing, Mark and Eleanor sat across from each other in the penthouse, papers scattered between them. The weight of what was about to happen hung in the air. Eleanor was quieter than usual, her mind racing with the thought of what Nathan might do once he realized they were onto him. Mark could sense her unease, and for the first time, he saw a crack in her armor, a vulnerability she hadn't shown him before. "You're worried about him, aren't you?" Mark asked softly. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I've spent my entire life protecting this company, protecting myself from people like Nathan. I thought I could control everything, but now I'm not sure anymore." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm scared of what might happen if this all falls apart." Mark leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this alone, Eleanor. I'm here. We're in this together, remember?" His words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor's gaze softened, and she nodded slowly. "I know," she whispered. "I just don't know how to let go of the fear. It's always been there, this constant fear of losing everything. And I don't know if I can handle it if it all comes crashing down." Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. For the first time, Eleanor didn't pull away. She let him hold her hand, the connection between them stronger than ever. "You've already lost so much, Eleanor," Mark said quietly. "But you've also gained so much. You have me. You have people who care about you. And that's something you can't control, but you don't need to. Let go of the fear. We'll face whatever happens next together." Eleanor sat still for a moment, absorbing his words. The weight of the situation still hung over her, but for the first time, she felt a small flicker of hope. Mark wasn't just offering her his support, was offering her something deeper. He was offering her the chance to finally let go of the loneliness and the fear that had defined her life for so long. The next day, they moved forward with the plan. Nathan had to be confronted. The evidence was clear, the truth undeniable, and Eleanor knew it was time to take back control of her life, even if it meant losing everything she had worked for. The meeting was set for late afternoon, and Mark would be there with her, every step of the way. As the hour drew closer, Eleanor's nerves began to resurface. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her suit in the mirror, the weight of the impending confrontation heavy on her chest. She had built her empire from the ground up, but now she was about to face the biggest challenge of her life. She couldn't do it alone. And as she turned to Mark, who was standing by the door, she knew that with him by her side, she could handle whatever came next. "You're ready for this," Mark said softly, his voice steady, as if to reassure them both. Eleanor took a deep breath, the weight of her fear and uncertainty still there, but now tempered by the strength she had found in him. She nodded, her voice a whisper of resolve. "Let's do this." As they walked out of the penthouse and into the waiting car, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was hope that no matter what happened in that meeting, she wasn't alone. And that was enough to give her the courage to face whatever Nathan had in store. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where the confrontation with Nathan takes an unexpected turn, and Eleanor faces a choice that could change everything. As Mark and Eleanor arrived at the meeting, the tension in the air was palpable. The company's conference room had never felt colder, the walls closing in on them with every passing second. Mark could feel Eleanor's hand trembling slightly in his, but he didn't let go. He had promised her that they would face this together, and he meant it. Eleanor had come a long way from the woman who had been closed off and distant, but today would test her more than ever. Nathan was a force to be reckoned with, arrogant, manipulative, and willing to do anything to keep control. And now, they had to expose him. They were fighting for Eleanor's life, for the future she had worked so hard to build. But Nathan wouldn't go down without a fight. As they entered the room, Nathan was already sitting at the large conference table, a smug smile on his face. His eyes flickered with amusement when he saw Mark and Eleanor walk in together. He knew exactly why they were there, but he had no idea that this time, things were about to be different. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of confidence. "Eleanor," he said smoothly, "I thought you might finally see things my way. You've been playing this game long enough. Don't you think it's time to stop pretending?" Eleanor held her ground, her back straight and her chin held high. She didn't flinch, even as Nathan's gaze tried to pierce through her. She was no longer the woman who cowered under his manipulation. This was her moment to take back control. "I'm done pretending, Nathan," she said firmly, her voice unwavering. "This game is over. I know what you've been doing, and it's time for you to face the consequences." For a brief moment, Nathan's confident smile faltered, but only for a second. He quickly recovered, leaning forward with an air of mock sympathy. "Consequences? Eleanor, you don't know what you're getting into. You've always been so naive, so quick to trust people. But you've made a mistake. I'm not the enemy here. I'm just trying to do what's best for this company." Mark couldn't help but feel a surge of anger at Nathan's words. He had seen this before. People like Nathan always played the victim when they were caught red-handed. But Eleanor wasn't fooled. She had spent years building this company, and no matter how much Nathan tried to manipulate her, she wasn't backing down. "You've been stealing from this company for years, Nathan," Eleanor said coldly. "You've been siphoning off money, forging documents, trying to undermine everything I've worked for. And I'm done letting you get away with it." Nathan's eyes narrowed, his expression turning cold. The smugness was gone now, replaced by a dangerous glint in his gaze. "You think you can take me down just like that? You have no idea what I'm capable of, Eleanor. You're making a big mistake." Eleanor took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "I'm not making a mistake, Nathan. The only mistake I made was trusting you in the first place." She turned to Mark, her eyes meeting his with a quiet determination. "This ends today." Mark nodded, squeezing her hand in reassurance. He knew that this was the moment. This was the moment that would change everything for Eleanor. The evidence they had gathered was irrefutable, and with the support of the lawyers they had on their side, Nathan wouldn't be able to escape the consequences of his actions. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur as Eleanor and Mark presented the evidence, exposing Nathan's crimes for all to see. It was a bitter pill for Eleanor to swallow, seeing her own brother brought to justice in such a way. But she knew it was the only way to protect everything she had built. When the meeting ended, Nathan was escorted out by security, his arrogant facade shattered. As Eleanor sat back in her chair, she felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't over yet. There would still be legal battles ahead, and the emotional toll of what had just happened would take time to heal. But for the first time in years, she felt free. She had taken back control. And she hadn't done it alone. Mark had been by her side every step of the way, and she realized, in that moment, that she wasn't just grateful for his support. She was starting to care for him in a way that went beyond the business arrangement they had once shared. Mark stood up, walking over to her and offering his hand. "You did it, Eleanor," he said softly. "You took control back." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you," she whispered, taking his hand. And as they left the conference room together, walking side by side, Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer alone. With Mark by her side, she could face anything that came her way. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Eleanor and Mark begin to rebuild their lives, and a new chapter of their relationship begins to unfold. As the weeks passed, Eleanor's life slowly began to return to some semblance of normalcy. With Nathan's betrayal exposed and the company's future secured, she could finally breathe a little easier, but there was still a part of her that couldn't quite let go of the past, the fear, the loneliness, and the walls she had built around herself. She had spent so many years protecting her empire, controlling everything around her, that now, with the dust settling, she wasn't sure where to go next. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about her. About what she wanted for herself beyond the business, beyond the fear. And as she stood in her office, staring out at the city skyline, she realized how far she had come. She had faced her biggest fear, losing control, and had come out stronger on the other side. But there was still something missing. She had Mark by her side, but the feelings between them had grown more complicated than either of them had anticipated. Mark had been her rock throughout the entire ordeal. He had never wavered, never hesitated to support her, even when the stakes were at their highest. And as much as Eleanor had tried to keep things professional, to keep their relationship focused solely on business, she couldn't ignore the connection they shared. The more time they spent together, the more she realized that this was no longer just a partnership, it was something more. One evening, after another long day at work, Mark stopped by Eleanor's office. She had been working late again, trying to catch up on the mess Nathan had left behind. When he walked in, he found her sitting at her desk, her eyes tired but determined. "You know you don't have to do this all by yourself," Mark said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "You've been through so much already. Let me help." Eleanor looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat at the sincerity in his eyes. For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of everything that had happened hanging in the air between them. Eleanor could feel the walls she had spent years building start to crack, and for the first time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of losing control. She wasn't afraid of what might happen if she let someone in. "I don't want to do this alone anymore, Mark," Eleanor said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so many years trying to protect myself, trying to keep everyone at arm's length. But I don't want to keep pushing people away. I don't want to keep pretending that everything is fine when it's not." Mark's heart swelled at her words. He walked over to her, kneeling down beside her chair, taking her hand in his. "You don't have to pretend with me, Eleanor. You never did. We're in this together, no matter what." For the first time in a long time, Eleanor let herself lean into him, her head resting on his shoulder. It felt so natural, so right, in a way that nothing had felt for so long. She realized, in that moment, that she wasn't just letting go of her fears. She was letting go of the past, of the person she had been, and embracing who she was becoming. And she wasn't doing it alone. "I don't know what the future holds," Eleanor said softly, "but I know I don't want to face it without you." Mark smiled, his voice gentle. "Then let's take it one step at a time, together." As the days turned into months, Eleanor and Mark's relationship blossomed into something neither of them had expected, but both of them needed. It wasn't just about business anymore. It was about trust, love, and building a future together. Eleanor had learned that control wasn't everything. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do was let go. And so, as the sun set over the city, Eleanor sat with Mark, looking out at the skyline, her heart full of hope. She had faced her fears, rebuilt her life, and found something even more valuable than success, love. And with Mark by her side, she knew that anything was possible. Stay tuned for the next part of the story, where Eleanor and Mark begin their next adventure, one where the future is filled with endless possibilities.